All right, how's everybody doing? Yeah, we've got a few people out, I can tell. First home game, Kansas City Chiefs in town. But you got a seat, right? They're sitting there at the stadium, and you guys are in here, and you get to go to heaven. So, I love this storied series. It has been just a pleasure to, with our team, our leadership team, to talk about. To kind of get into some of these stories. I've said this, I think, week after week. We have a Come and Listen series where we've been, from 2014, kind of going through the entire narrative arc of the Bible. And you almost feel like I'm not allowed to go back and teach some of these stories. But we miss so much in the Come and Listen series because the Bible's big. And there's lots of stories and lots of narratives. And there's lots of sub-narratives within those. And I've loved being able to go back and look at these storied, these legendary stories that all lead to the ultimate story of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. It's incredible. And what the author of the Jesus Storybook Bible says is every page whispers his name. It all leads to Jesus at the end of the day. And man, this series really has just, I think, expanded my heart and my mind. Even as we were worshiping today, I just thought, man, what an amazing thing it is to know and believe that Jesus is alive, that he is a king, that he is in the room, that when we're worshiping, we're not just, thinking maybe there's something out there, maybe there's something, but there's belief as doubt leaves and belief enters the heart. He's here. Last week we talked about what God values versus what we value, or more correctly, what we value versus what God values. And we were, in episode 1, in the legendary storied life of David. And we talked about that God values the heart and character more than he values success and outward appearance. I mean, it's one of those obvious things as David's being anointed. God tells Samuel, hey, I'm not looking at the outside appearance. I'm looking at what's happening inside. I'm looking at what spiritually is going on. And David's being pulled in not because man wants him in that position, but because God does. And then, where does the heart get developed? We talked about the pasture. When we're in the pasture, we often think, what? We think, how long, am I going to be here? And why am I here? But God does some amazing work in the pasture. Sometimes it takes longer than we think, but God has a different concept of what it looks like and what he's developing in and through us. And lastly, and this one is a little bit harder to hold on to, is that God values God. More than anything, he values himself. And I got a little feedback this week from our high school leaders saying that's a hard concept to kind of get across to even high school students who, most of them are taking classes that are, you wouldn't be able to pass. So they're smart, they know things. But the idea of God valuing God, and we're going to kind of pick up there as we're in episode 2 in covering David. So if you got your Bible, we're going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 6, one of the most epic stories in Scripture. But there's so many subplots and sub-narratives in this story. It's going to be a whole lot of fun. But, when we think about God valuing himself, this story is going to kind of cover the journey of the Ark of the Covenant. We see that in this story. Like we'll grab a hold of very quickly that God values God, that he believes he is the most important thing, that he has no rival. There is no equal to who God is. But how do we get a hold of that? Like that feels a little distant. It almost feels a little bit icky. C.S. Lewis said it's like an old woman wanting compliments. Like, I am awesome. But that is not. When you are the creator of the universe, when you did breathe out the stars, everything that we see, we want God to be confident. I mean, that's who we want to be sovereign in our lives. That's who we want to surrender to. But I think that the way to break it down, and I always, illustrations break down very quickly, especially when you put yourself in the center. But I was thinking about when my kids were young. I'm thinking of one kid in particular, but I won't call him out because, I didn't tell them about this. They won't mind. But doing homework with kids when they're young, you sometimes get to a point when they're in middle school and maybe even starting in elementary where they kind of want your help, but then when you help them, they're getting mad at you and they're telling you, well, this is how we do it in our class. This is what we do. And we're doing math. And with this particular kid, we're doing math homework. And I'm just like, hey, this is how you do it. 10 times out of 10, this is always going to equal this. And this is the right answer. I don't know what to tell you. And you get into this, and they argue with you, and they fight with you. And at some point, they're like, you don't even know. Like, you just don't know. And for me, In my previous life, computer science and engineering was what I did. I'm pretty good at math. It's one of those things, pretty good. And when you know about yourself that you're the best option for them, I am the best option for you. There is no other. There is no rival or equal in this house to the math wizard. And I'm quiet about it, and I don't say it, but I just want them to know, hey, there's no better. It's not that I'm arrogant. I just want you to know, because I love you and I want you to pass math, that I'm your best option. You need me. So when God says that he values himself, what he's saying is that, hey, I want you to understand how just how sufficient I am. I value me because I love you. So I want to start that as we jump in this journey, because in the Old Testament, sometimes when we think about the power of God, the holiness of God, it can get a little uncomfortable. But ultimately, I want you to have that picture of a father and a child, and the father saying, hey, right now, you don't have a concept of the perspective I have. I've lived a lot longer. I know a lot more stuff, and I'm your best option. Think about that as God's leading the people of God, as he's leading our own heart. Because this legendary story narrative ultimately is about worship because of God's glory, which would be his weightiness and his worth. That translates in the Old Testament to weight and worth. So when you're thinking about this idea of glory, it can be this weird concept. We think about the glory days. That kind of gets us there a little bit, but when we think about God's glory, it's really weight and worth. What is his weight and what is his worth? And this legendary narrative is ultimately about worship. It's one of the best ones. I love this one when I was, when you go to church, because it's about David dancing naked before the Lord. That's only a few translations. You're going to be like, it doesn't say naked in mine. Well, eventually they didn't put that in there. But it does say half naked. He was undignified. This is David coming before the Lord, and people that are looking at him from the outside with no context are thinking, this man is a crazy man. He has lost his mind. He's worshiping with all of his might before the Lord. So David, and we know because last week we talked about David understanding the magnitude of God. Why did he understand? Because he spent a large portion of his life before he became king. He was anointed king, and then for years he went back to the pasture. But guess what he wasn't doing? He wasn't, curled up on his bed on his phone. He was on his back looking up at the sky. He was looking at the Milky Way. He was looking at the sun, the moon, the stars that God had set in place. He was wondering why God was mindful of him, why the Son of Man, why he cared for him. He thought, mind blown. So David had a magnitude, like a right sizing. When we read the Psalms, the heavens are declaring the glory of God. He understood without even knowing the science of the size of the universe, that the innumerable amount of galaxies, which we are just less than a grain of sand, less than a speck of dust in a galaxy. He understood something in his mind. He understood the magnitude of God. So when we think about this passage and thinking about God valuing God, and we think about worship, we're going to talk about this expressive nature of David's worship. At least that's where we're going to land today. And everybody in the room's got a different opinion. I don't know where you grew up or how what your experience is. Maybe you haven't. Maybe OCC is one of your first experiences in a while. 15 years, 20 years, been out of church. You're back in. Maybe you grew up Catholic, Presbyterian, Baptist, Pentecostal. Some people, it's hymns and turn to page 467 and, blessed be the tie that binds, right? It's the family hymn. We're going to sing it all together. And then Pentecostals are like, if somebody doesn't pass out, then we didn't really worship, we got something seriously got to happen. We got to get down before things happen. And everybody's got their different postures, It's, there's the sway. There's always this is just me calling it out the way it is. There's always there's a dude in the back, got his arms folded like this, and the wife, I think she might want to get undignified and raise a hand and all that, but she's worried about, Teddy's over here, and Teddy's, he likes the music, but, doing all this, we ain't going there. So she's just got a good sway going, in the back, hoping one day we're praying for Teddy, And then there's the people that is just full on touchdown Jesus, bread basket, I'm at the bread basket sometimes because I sweat, and you just don't want to show that to the rest of the world. The one arm and the heart pound, because we're going to make that thing beat for Jesus. There's all kinds, and I just want to say this because I know I've had conversations with people in here, just, the portions of church that you like. Like I like the worship, or I like the talk, I like the studying aspect, I like the music, but I don't necessarily understand this, this idea of closing your eyes and thinking about and leaning towards God. And today will break some of that down. What was it that made David do that? Are a lot of the things that really in our heart, we need to. Worship is good for us. We were built and made as human beings to worship. You're going to worship something. I mean, worship is what? It's our response to what matters most. So there's a lot of things that we worship, even unknowingly. It's how we respond, to what matters most. I mean, it's great. In football season, people have used this illustration time and time again. People worship at football games. I mean, the hands go up, faces get painted, people get a little bit undignified at football games. It's an indication of I value the Jaguars, or I value the Gators, or I value the Seminoles, whatever it is that is in where I value the Tennessee Volunteers. Whatever it is, it's like this is the thing that I value, and we respond to that. Worship, it does go a little deeper, though. The reasons why we worship is not just something that we learn as church people. It's something that's evoked by the heart and what God does. So if you got your Bible, this is an epic one. You're gonna have to hold on because we're gonna get into this thing. So 2 Samuel chapter 6. Now David, obviously, he is king, and things are changing. I mean, the reign of Saul was very different. One that was fraught with war. Not that all of them aren't, but David's reign. Definitely less. They start winning things when David rolls in and becomes king. So he's making some changes to the government. He's just a different guy and has a different heart. He was a man after God's own heart. So the things that David wanted to do when he began to reign are different than Saul's. One of the reasons God had rejected Saul and leaned towards David, and he was anointed as king. So verse 1, 2 Samuel chapter 6, David again brought together all the able young men of Israel, 30,000. Now, let me explain why he's gathering everybody. He's getting ready to go get the Ark of the Covenant. And he's getting 30,000. I want you to keep that in mind. 30,000 dudes just to go get an ark. The ark's not big. I mean, that's just your estimation. It's not a big thing. It's got poles. He's going to get it. 30,000. He and all his men went to Baalah and Judah to bring up the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim on the ark. So that's indicating what we're getting ready to talk about, which is the ark really was not just a representation of the presence of God. It was where God actually infused his presence. It's called special, theologically. It's not as much a theophany as the pillar of cloud. We've talked about a theophany in here, the idea of a manifestation of the Spirit of God on planet Earth that we see in the Old Testament. The pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire that we saw in the Old Testament, the burning bush, those are all theophanies. This is more like what we call special presence. So the ark was where they believed and God did reside. We'll see in this story, God's presence resided. So we're going to answer this question because I think we have to get into this and learn a little before we can understand how central the Ark of the Covenant was and how it kind of connects us to worship. You never thought, hey, the Ark of the Covenant is why we worship the way that we worship here in Jacksonville Beach. But it does have some things that we can talk about. So what is the Ark of the Covenant? There you go. All right, so the Ark of the Covenant. So back in when we were in Exodus, we went in the storied series. We covered Moses, but we didn't really talk about the giving of the law. We talked a little bit about at Mount Sinai, but we didn't talk about the tabernacle as much and the structure of worship and the Ark of the Covenant. Now, keep in mind the Garden of Eden, right? You get all the way back at the beginning of the story. Sin happens. God is holy. Now we've got man is sinful. What happens? Adam and Eve get booted out of the Garden of Eden, and at the east end of the Garden of Eden, there's angels with fiery swords. Like they're not coming back in, and there is a gulf between relationship, the relationship that man had with God. There is nothing there. Now, from that moment on, God's redemptive plan's already in place. I mean, it is already in place. Now, when we begin to see the tabernacle, you probably like, why do I even need to know about the tabernacle? Well, it gives you an idea of the distance between God and man. and what needs to happen to bring the creator of the universe back together with his creation, being us, right? So we get, in Egypt, God told them to construct this big wooden box and overlay it with gold inside and out, and that was going to be the place where his presence would dwell. It sounds very strange, right? Like, hey, you're going to take this wooden box, there's going to be some things that you're going to put in it. On top, there were two golden angels facing each other with this thing called the mercy seat. It was placed in the tabernacle in a place called the Holy of Holies, where it was the only piece of furniture in there. Like, that was it. It was just the Ark of the Covenant. I want to give you a picture of the tabernacle, and we'll kind of walk through this a little bit. I'll go to this side. I don't know why. Just feels better. Oh, we died? Picture. He's like, nope, we don't have it. It doesn't like it. No? Yes. All right. So this is the tabernacle. So this is a precursor to the temple, right? And the way that it would work is you've got the outer court where most people could be in the outer court. Now, sacrifices took place, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, at the threshold of the temple and the threshold of the tabernacle. Tabernacle was there before the temple was built. You got the outer court, you've got the holy place, you got the altar of incense, and then you've got the Holy of Holies. The ark was placed in the Holy of Holies. And one time a year, so you got on the top of the ark, you got these two cherubim, and in the center of that would be the mercy seat. A priest one time a year would go through this incredible cleansing ritual, and one time a year, one priest, the high priest, was allowed to go beyond this curtain and go into the Holy of Holies. He would sprinkle, with the hyssop branch, he would sprinkle blood on the mercy seat, and they would have this huge sacrifice, and that would be the covering of sin for the people for that year. It's this representation that one day God would cover the sins. There would be a blood sacrifice to come. You get what I'm saying? You picking up what I'm laying down? That something would happen. They didn't even understand what it was. They just knew that this was part of God's promise and a representation. Now, they knew better because this was where God's presence would dwell. Right there in the Holy of Holies with the Ark of the Covenant. And placed in it was the 10 Commandments were in there, the two tablets. There was a jar of manna that was in there to represent God's providential, like God is going to provide for us. 10 Commandments were there to say God's holy. It was a representation of God's holiness, set apart, the people of God's set apartness, and the law. And then Aaron's rod was in there because it like would bud fruit, like miraculously. If you read scripture, I won't go into that story. So they put Aaron's staff in there, the tablets, and a jar of manna were in the Ark of the Covenant. If you're wondering what happened when they opened the lid and Raiders of the Lost Ark and everybody's faces melted, they were looking at manna. I don't know. I don't know kind of how that happened. I want to read this because it'll give you an idea of the amazing nature of the Ark of the Covenant, because I don't know that, a lot of us, that is our only context for the Ark of the Covenant, is watching Harrison Ford do his thing. But I want you to get your heart wrapped around this, because it is really the centerpiece to this narrative. This guy does a really good job from Ligonier Ministries, Daniel Hyde. He says this, he says, here is such a mind-blowing idea about the God of the Bible that we have to pause for a moment. The eternal God who is not constrained by the existence of time, the infinite God who is not bound by the constraints of space, the transcendent God who dwells above and beyond all time and space, and the immense God who fills all time and space. What did he do? He condescended to the weakness of his people and became manifest for their benefit in one locale. That is the Ark of the Covenant. And it's a forerunner to Christ, right? The Ark of the Covenant. This God is not bound by time, but he bound himself to the time-bound experience of his people. This is part of God sacrificing. He didn't have to do this and be in one place. God is omnipresent, but he all of a sudden became in this place. This God is not bound by space, but he bound himself to this box. He is above all creational constraints, but he bound himself to them. He is everywhere, but he was there. That is mind-blowing to me. When you think about it, put the tabernacle back up there real quick. That God who exists everywhere made this decision for the benefit of his people, to give hope that there's something coming, that there will be a sacrifice made, there will be something that will bring us back together. And temporarily, you get a glimpse of my presence. They could come into the presence of God. One priest, one time a year, come before the mercy seat where God would extend mercy and say, hey, you're not going to die in my presence because of my holiness, because of the sacrifice that was made. It was a forerunner. It was a picture of what is to come. So the other question is why? So we've got David going back to get the Ark of the Covenant. He's taking 30,000 people to go get it. What you find out if you read the same account, 2 Samuel chapter 6, it crosses over with 1 Chronicles chapter 13. And what you find out is that the ark's been gone for 20 years. So the second question I want to answer real quick, and we'll get into the rest of this passage, is why had the ark been out of sight for 20 years? Okay? So we get, if you can put a little cross-reference. You don't have to. I'm going to tell it as quickly as I can. But in 1 Samuel chapter 4, we find out. It's before the reign of David, before the reign of Saul. Samuel it's right in that zone where Samuel is being selected as judge, prophet. The Israelites had sinned against God like they had done many times in the Judges period. And the Philistines had kind of risen to be the primary person that they were fighting all the time in that territory. And they were getting ready to go to battle against the Philistines again. And they had this bright idea. They had just gotten their butt whooped. Thousands had died. They're getting ready to go back out to battle in the next day or two. And they think, hey, you know what we should do? And that's why I showed this, is I want this to be in context. We should go get the Ark of the Covenant and bring that into battle. That'll be smart. Think about this. It's in the place that God has said this is where it should reside, in the tabernacle. There's only very few instances where you're going to tote that thing around. If you're traveling, you're going to tote it around, but it's going to make its way back to the Holy of Holies where it's supposed to remain. This is the way that God had asked that it always be done. And they're like, hey, let's go get the ark and we'll take that into battle. That'll be a good idea. So they do. They go, go to where the ark is established. It's in Shiloh. You find out that was the capital city before Jerusalem was. So they go to Shiloh. Obviously, it's there. It's being taken care of by Eli, who was the priest at the time, his two sons who had been trained, of Phinehas and Hophni. If you're getting ready to have a baby, there you go. There's two good ones. They go there and say, hey, you guys are going to be in charge of watching the ark while they take this thing in the battle. So they take the ark into battle against the Philistines, like a lucky rabbit's foot, like a good luck charm. And what you'll find out is God's not going to be manipulated that way. And they got another butt whooping. Phinehas and Hophni die, and so do thousands and thousands of Israelites. And in the middle of that, the Philistines capture the ark and take it with them. It's crazy. If you go read, some crazy stuff happens. When they go back and they tell Eli, the high priest, and say, hey, just to let you know, your son's died. He's in shock at that point, and oh, by the way, the Philistines took the ark. The dude was apparently heavy. It says because he was heavy, he was in a chair. As soon as he heard the news, he fell out of his chair, broke his neck, and he died. And a woman that was nearby heard the news at the same time, and immediately she gave birth. That's lots of business, lots of stuff happening. Told you the story's amazing. Oh, it gets crazier. It doesn't. So the Philistines take the ark to Ashdod. They put it in. Their god is Dagon. And so the Philistines are like super stoked. They're like, we got this sweet, piece of mid-century furniture. We're going to throw it in our temple. And they throw it in there with their god, Dagon, who is like, it's the fish god. I don't know what that is, but if you look up pictures, it's like a merman. It's like a mermaid with like a beard and looks very strange. And that was who they worshiped. I know. I just don't understand how they lasted as long as they did. But they put the ark in their temple. And the next day they go in and they find their god, Dagon's huge, massive statue in this little box, this gold box that they were really excited about. Dagon, their god's literally broken over and fallen over, laying in front of the Ark of the Covenant. I'm like, man, that's weird. So they take Dagon and they prop Dagon back up, get a bunch of dudes, and they load him back up. And then the next day, they come back out the next morning. Again, massive statue. Fallen over right before the Ark of the Covenant, no head, no hands. Like the head's broken off and the hands are broken off. And they find them at the threshold of the doorway of the temple. And they're like, this is weird. And then somebody comes running up and says, hey, something crazy's happening in the town. There's like rats or mice everywhere. Like we've got this weird thing happening, and people are just getting these weird fat tumors, and they're dying. Like people are dying, and they're like, could this have something to do with that box? Maybe that's what it is. So they decide, they think about it. They're like, what should we do? So they decide to re-gift it to the town next to them. Can you imagine that? They're like, wrap it up, put it on a cart. And so they send it to Gath, the place next to them. And guess what happens? Same thing. Tumors and rats, people die, and they're like, man, I cannot believe this thing's starting to become like the white elephant gift of Israel and the Philistines. And like, we're going to wait till Christmas. And they send it to Ekron, and the same thing happens in Ekron. I think I've got the picture of this thing travels around for a while. Let me see if I can see what's happening here. Yeah. So you can see it started in Shiloh. They take it into battle. It ends up in Ashdod. That's where Dagon falls over twice, and they get tumors and rats, and they start getting upset about that. They're like, yeah, let's pack this bad boy up. They send it to Gath. They're like, woo, this is a great gift. We got a gold box. Uh-oh, that's not a good idea. Gets to Ekron, and then by the time it gets to Ekron, they're like, hey, we don't want this thing. They get all of their Philistine priests together, and they say, what should we do? And they're like, well, we got to send it back to the Israelites. This is the craziest. There's a discussion in the Bible they start having. They're like, well, we can't just send it back because we took it. Maybe we should make some gifts to send back with the ark. It literally says that in the passage. Let's make some gifts. So they decide to make gold rats and mice and tumors. I don't even know what a gold tumor looks like. I don't know if they're like, it's like this and it's a blob. Like, tumor looks kind of like the one that Terry had. Let's put it in there. And the gold rats and tumors, and they stick it not in the ark because they know better. Along with the ark, and then they send it back. And you can see here where it ends up. There's a group of people at Beth Shemesh. They get the ark, and they recognize it, and they know what it is. Now, what's crazy is before it even left there, when it was at Ekron, they're like, so what do we do? We're going to put the gifts in there. Go put the gifts in. They start talking about who's going to go with it. Before they even knew who was going to go with it, the cows already started heading towards Israel. And it was a long way off before that. I just thought that was super cool. The cows are like, we know where to take this thing. It's got to go back to where it's supposed to go. And it ends up in Beth Shemesh. They realize what it is. They grab it. They go get the priest, say, hey, you guys are supposed to be the ones that handle this. So they take it to this place and try to treat it the way that they're supposed to. And then a bunch of people from Beth Shemesh get curious. I don't know. It seems like one of those episodes. It's like Stand By Me. It's like, oh, let's go look at the dead body. So people went to look at it. A bunch of people opened it and looked in it. And guess what happened to them? They died. Yeah, you don't look inside the ark. Have you seen Raiders of the Lost Ark? Please, you're going to get your face melted off. And they did. A bunch of them died, and they're like, what do? We don't even know how to deal with this. So the ark ends up with it at a guy named Abinadab's house, who was a priest, and his son. They basically trained him to be the one that knew everything about the ark and could take care of the ark. And that's where the ark stayed for the next 20 years, at some dude's house, not in the tabernacle, in a house. It just blows me away. And you think about the reign of Saul, you only have one instance where Saul even mentions or talks about it. In First Chronicles chapter 13, it says specifically that Saul really never inquired about the presence of God in the ark that way. Like he just didn't during his whole reign. David, pretty much the first thing he's doing is going, where's the Ark of the Covenant? We got to go get that bad boy. And he gets, think about this. This is a box that's not super huge. David gets 30,000 dudes and says, we're going to get 30,000 dudes. And then he gets like 15 worship teams and says, we're all going to Abinadab. Could you imagine being at Abinadab's house and you're like, somebody knocks on the door, you look at the ring and you're like, dang, some people out there, 30,000 people outside your door to pick, and you're wondering, I wonder what they're here for. Yeah, they knew. It's, it was just one of those things. So it says they came to so they get there, and they build another ox cart. They get to Abinadab's house. Abinadab's like, yeah, you can, you're king, you can take it. They put it on the cart. They start having, they're like celebrating, having worship services, doing the thing. And then in verse 6, it says, when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark because they'd stumbled. So this thing's moving across the threshing floor, which would be a rocky, place where they would, bang out the wheat. We talked about that. They'd throw it up in the air and all the chaff would float away. Well, this is where that was. And it kind of rolls and Uzzah reaches out for the ark. They're super excited, 30,000 people, 10 worship teams, playing lyres, harps, Gibsons, Fenders, whatever they got. They're jamming, having a good time. They're partying, getting ready to take this thing back to the city of David. In verse 7, it says, the Lord's anger, this guy grabs the ark, burns against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down, and he died beside the ark of God. It says, then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah, and to this day, that place is called Perez Uzzah. In verse 9, it says, David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, how can the Lord ever come to me? He was very frustrated. This is what he wanted. And he's really upset that Uzzah had died. He was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. This guy wasn't even a Jew. It was like the closest place they could dump this thing off. They're like, wait, this is crazy. Let's be very, very careful. And I guess we'll take it to Obed-Edom's house. And that's where it's going to stay. I mean, you get this? Like, David's angry. Like, a guy's just died. They're in this place of celebration. The guy reaches out, touches the ark, and he's struck dead. Now David's angry at God. It's like David and God, who, he wrote Psalms about God. They broke up temporarily. It's a little breakup. I don't know what you're thinking, but he was angry. Now, why is this important? I think these are the parts that are uncomfortable in the Old Testament, aren't they? Right? Like, gosh, this doesn't seem this guy was trying to do the right thing. Well, one, I just want to say this. We don't know the context of, what Uzzah's life or who he was or anything that happened before this. There's nothing that we know. So, understanding God's justice in one way, I mean, there's just like, hey, we got to trust that God knows what he's doing. God is holy. We are broken and sinful. All of us deserve death. But that doesn't quite do it for us all the time when we're thinking about the Old Testament, does it? But here's what I do think is pretty interesting about this whole thing. How's this even helpful to even have in here? I think everybody in here you probably at some point been offended. Like, I just want to say, you're not the first person to be offended by the Bible. You're not the first person to be offended by God. And what's great about the Bible is that David's in the Bible and he is offended. And he is frustrated in the way that he thinks about why God would do what he does. And I think this is helpful because in the same way that many of us in the room have found a way to believe, David still found a way to believe despite this issue of God's holiness. Like, when we look at the end of the story, this wasn't the end of the story. David's not going, okay, now I'm walking away forever and this is it. Because I don't really, have a concept of the holiness of God and the brokenness of sinful man. This doesn't seem fair. It doesn't, in my mind, in the way that I kind of think about justice, it just doesn't seem fair, so I'm going to bail. What I love about this is it's in here. It lets us know that, we can't puff ourselves up with arrogance and think we're the first person to be offended by God or the Bible. David was. But yet, he did find himself back to a way of believing who God was. Now, what we find out in verse 11 says, the Ark of the Covenant remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. So David finds out that Obed's getting blessed. Like, he hears the word that for 3 months, good things are happening. So that triggers somebody. He's like, oh, no, we're going to get that thing. He's like, we're going back, and we're gonna pick it up. Now, what they do figure out in 2 Samuel chapter 6, you don't see this in there. You're like, they go get it, and you're like, well, how did they go get it? Did they know how to carry it? Did they know what to do? Well, you look at the cross references. It's amazing about the Bible. There's so many different cross references. So 2 Chronicles chapter 13, you see that they had made a mistake. Who kind of came up with putting it on an ox cart? The Philistines did. That was the way that they carried it. 20 years had passed and they really weren't thinking about it, but they never even went back and checked to find out, okay, how are we supposed to carry this thing? Well, the Levitical law says, guess what? When you build this ark, you're going to put some holes in it. You're going to put some things with some little dealies right here. And guess what you do with those holes? You craft these poles. They're going to be crafted a certain way. And guess what you do with the poles? You put the poles in the holes. That's how you carry the ark. So they put the poles in the holes. They carried the ark and everything was fine. I mean, it was just a transition. You find out all these little things. It was like, and what I love about that, it's just a side sermon and thinking about the Ark of the Covenant. Hey, it's one way. God's got his way. Hey, you can think it's your way, and there should be many ways to do things. It's all, it's many ways to heaven, many ways up the mountain. Why does it have to be Jesus? It's one way, people. God decides. You don't get to decide. God said, poles in the holes. That's the way we're going to carry this thing. We're not going to do an ox cart. We're not going to settle it. Bam. That's it. It's God's way. It's salvation. Look, it's not exclusive. Anyone can come, but it's always going to come through Jesus, right? It's not, well, Jesus, it just doesn't seem fair. No, it's everyone is welcome. Anyone and everyone is invited into the unending ocean of grace, but it's one way, right? It's coming through Jesus. He is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through him. Verse 13, when those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull. Think about that. 6 steps, and then bad news for any bulls that were around or fattened calves. Slaughtered them, had a sacrifice right there. Wearing a linen ephod, David danced before the Lord with all his might. So he's already beginning his dancing journey in his holy underoos. Like he's ready to go. He's down to his underwear, and he's like, we're going to dance with all our might. And while he and all Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and sounds of trumpets. Verse 16, the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, and Michal, daughter of Saul, who was his wife, watched from the window. When she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. So she didn't dig it. She's not down with the whole dancing thing in the linen ephod. Like, it's like you got to wear a suit to church. You cannot do what you're doing. It makes you think, have you ever despised somebody and their style of worship? Gone into a church and like, man, there's a hopper in the front row. And if I bring somebody and they're hopping in the front row, trying to get them saved, and you got a hopper, better not despise them, right? She despised him. Verse 20, then David returned home to bless his household. Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, how the king of Israel has distinguished himself today. I mean, I can hear this. Oh my goodness. How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls, of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would. It's just funny. It just seems like, husband and wife having a conversation. Verse 21. So she's not happy about David and his worship. She has a lower view of who God is and the understanding that God wants all of us to have about who he is. Verse 21, David said to Michal, it was before the Lord. Now listen to this. Who chose me? This is something David knows in his mind about God, the God of the universe, who chose me. Isn't that an amazing thing? There's something that's clear in David's mind. The one that the star breather picked me rather than your father or anyone else from his household when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I mean, if you think you have family problems, I mean, these people, no, it's like you bringing up mom and in-laws and things are getting a little bit crazy. And I will celebrate. He says, look, I don't care. God chose me. I'm going to celebrate before the Lord. And then he says, I will become even more undignified than this. See, it wasn't just Matt Redman who said it or David Crowder. See, some of you have been around a while and you know what I'm talking about. I'll become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. Some of your translations, I will be debased, like I don't mind. But these girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor. And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. It's pretty harsh for despising David's worship. But worship is our response to what matters most. And David's responding. So my question would be, how do we come to understand what matters most? How do you make the transition in our minds? Because there's a lot of things that we put in that place of mattering most. But as you read this story and you begin to understand the Ark of the Covenant, you understand David's, like you look through the lens of David. He's like, we're going to get the presence of God. Not going to get some box. He's like, we're gonna encounter the holiest of holies. We're going to encounter, we are going to stand before. I mean, he's like, we're taking 30,000 people. This is not a small thing. We're taking, tons of instruments. We're going to get our voices warmed up because this is going to be a celebration. He knew that God deserved worship, but he knew that that's what he wanted to do. Everything in him knew that it was the right thing. So what did David understand, and what should we understand when it comes to who God is? How do we glean that from this story? Number one, understanding the power of God's presence. There's something about this story where we have to understand the power of God's presence. You know, when you think about even the Philistines, they had no clue about the power of God's presence. I mean, they had a shred maybe because they're like, the ark belongs in a temple. That's about as far as it got in terms of understanding just how powerful the manifestation of God's presence would be. But they had their God and they kept propping it up. I mean, this is just another side sermon. If you've got to prop up your God, you probably need another God. Like if that's the way that you're, and I think when we look at that, it's like they underestimated who God was. And they had other gods that they propped up. And I think sometimes we underestimate who God is. When I think about who we are in the story, sometimes I'm like, you know, we're always looking at ourselves. We must be David. We must be the Israelites. We're these people. The Philistines is the enemy, the evil people. I think we're kind of like the Philistines. You know, we just don't really have a concept of who God is. And we put other things in that position. And we keep propping it up. And it doesn't work over and over and over again. Until finally that God falls over. And it will always bow to the ultimate. It will never, ever, ever be as powerful, as redemptive as Jesus and as God. And understanding the power of God's presence. It's interesting, Dave and Sarah and me and Beth and Caitlin, we went to Africa last year. And it was it last year? Yeah, it was last year. And you know, you think about how our view of the presence of God, like Dave said this earlier, where two or more are gathered, like he's here, like the presence of God and the power of God's presence. We went to Uganda and we, if you haven't been around here a while, we were able to plant a church there, able to fund their building structure, and that's what it was. I should have brought another picture. A lot of you guys have seen it, but I mean, it's basically just, you know, four corner, you know, big poles, sticks, basically, and a roof. And a place where they could gather and worship. And I don't think I was prepared to roll up on that scene, but they had an understanding and a proper perspective of the presence of God where two or more are gathered that was a little different than mine. They really understood the power of God in a way that evoked worship, because we rolled up the excitement that they had a place where the holy God of the universe could be found in one locale by the glory of God in their world, where they could worship together, where they could invite God by singing and worshiping together. We rolled up and there was already a party going. I mean, it was so loud. I mean, we're getting out of our car, me and Dave and Sarah and Beth and Caitlin are like, people are like, I mean, crazy, crazy dancing. I mean, just going. Instruments were already going. I mean, it was moving. You couldn't help but move. I mean, everything you're doing to get back in there. And they move different. Y'all are predominantly white. They really got down. But part of that was they understood the power of God's presence. You know, they didn't roll into church and go, man, the coffee has grinds in it. Oh, no. Parking. Oh. I mean, these people didn't, that was not them. They're like, I get to commune with God. I get to be in the presence of the Almighty. David understood that. He's like, let's get 30,000 people. We're gonna jam the presence of God. Think about this. They would be, if you teleported somebody from the past, you know, one of those 30,000 people that knew about the Ark of the Covenant, and they found out that, guess what? That Jesus, the hope of glory, there's a deposit of the Spirit of God, the presence of God in you. That Jesus made a way that the presence of God could reside in you, their mind would be blown. They're like, the presence of God? The Ark of the Covenant presence of God, the holiness of God can reside in feeble and fallen clay? God's going to put the light in you, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, the light's going to exist in you. They would be out of their mind because they had a perspective that's different than ours. So understanding the power of God's presence, yes, that is going to evoke a certain type of thing and a certain type of worship. Number two, understanding the privilege of God's presence. The privilege. Understanding being in that place. Again, going back to the Uganda church, they understood the privilege of God's presence. Of who he is in comparison to who they were. I think sometimes it's us not understanding who our daddy is. Like we don't necessarily get it. And I love that. I think this is where God's mercy comes in. And I think he sees us and says, this is God valuing God, saying, this is who I am. I was just watching the documentary Kelsey, which is about Jason Kelsey, Travis Kelsey's brother, if you're NFL, follow the NFL. I mean, both Pro Bowlers, both very good NFL football players, and they met in the Super Bowl last year. And the documentary kind of follows Jason Kelsey throughout that year. It's really, really good. But at the end of the Super Bowl, and Jason Kelsey lost to his brother Travis, and he's laying on the bed, and he's with his kids, and his daughters are there, and all that could pop to my mind is they have no idea that this dude just played he's a Pro Bowler, just played in the Super Bowl. Like they have no concept of it. They do have a little bit, like a shred, and I think that's us. We have a shred of the concept of who God is, but they don't have a shred of the concept. I mean, the daughter literally is like, the mom's talking about the game and doing all the stuff, and they're excited for Travis, but sad that Jason didn't win. And, he's laying on the bed with his daughter, and she's like, I drew a picture for you. And I just thought, it's so sweet. And he's just looking at her with these adoring eyes. But one day, in her maturity, she's going to realize who he is. Now, again, all these things break down. He'll be an old man and he won't be playing football anymore. And I think life will have changed, but God will always be God. And the possibility for me and you, because I think we think about spiritual maturity. It's like, how many Bible verses do you know? What do you know about the Bible? No, it's do we understand the privilege of God's presence? Because if we do, then there's maturity there. It's like I've woken up to the idea that the one that spoke out galaxies into existence chose me. Now that is waking up. That's eventually, going from I painted a picture for you, I drew a picture for you and I'm on the bed, to every bit of my posture is bending upwards towards thank you for choosing me. I will be even more undignified. I don't care what they think, what they think, what they think, what they think, what they think. You care about me? You're with me and I'm with you? The God of the universe doesn't exist in space and time, has chosen to be in a locale right next to you, inside of you. That's waking up. It changes, it reframes the way that we sing and the way that we worship. It changes everything about who we are. The last thing, and I love this, is understanding the price for God's presence. And obviously, people died in order for them to get the ark back, right? There was people in Beth Shemesh, there was Uzzah, but those weren't necessarily sacrifices. That was just a matter of God's holiness. But what's interesting, if you read the account in 1 Chronicles chapter 13 and 14, as soon as David brought the temple back into the city of David, so it previously existed in Shiloh, the capital's being resituated in Jerusalem, the city of David. David had set up a tabernacle, just like we saw, and had it all ready and prepared for the ark, with all the specifications exactly the way that they were supposed to be. Again, I've said this before, about every 6 steps, they're rolling and they're having worship services. They're sacrificing bulls, and the whole way, they're just glad they're all alive. They're like, we've carried it a little bit. I guess the poles and the holes worked. And they keep setting it down and they keep singing. They finally get it to the city of David and they bring it into the tabernacle. It gets situated by the priests, because they had to do it, into the Holy of Holies. Now, before they ever do that, they have a sacrifice. They do a burnt offering, which a burnt offering, if you look, there's I could go through the 5 different types of offerings in Leviticus, but we'd be here for a few more hours. But there's 2. The burnt offering is like the complete offering where they sacrifice a bull and they burn it. All of it gets consumed. And that's like the complete offering. In other words, we give everything to you. We believe that you are all sufficient. So we give all of ourselves to you. So that's the burnt offering. And then there's this thing called the fellowship offering, which I think is super interesting. It's very gross. It's like a partial, like they burn some things. They like take a few organs out. They're like, these get burned for specific reasons. And then the other parts get consumed. Like they actually, you eat it. Like this is the part you consume. And they make these raisin cake things or fruit cakes. And then there's maybe I always like to think of it as a ribeye because it just seems a little more tasty than sacrifice meat. But they've got that meat and that gets consumed. Now, this is the cool part. Right at the door, can you put the tabernacle back up? There we go. Right at the threshold, you see it's got, this is where the altar is, where the sacrifice is made. They would kill the animal and right there, whether it had to be spotless lamb, spotless goat, or spotless calf, they would do it at the doorway. And there would be blood all over the doorway. You know why? Because to enter into the presence of God, there had to be bloodshed. There had to be blood on the doorway. There had to be blood in the entryway. So it all happened right there. They did not have the concept of why this was happening. They were just being obedient in their day. But for us, in our perspective, what we're understanding is the price for God's presence was going to be blood. It was going to be blood. And if you read Ephesians chapter 2, I mean, this blows me away. Because I don't know that we always make these connections, but Ephesians chapter 2, starting in verse 15, it's the Apostle Paul talking about Jesus being the sacrificial lamb. He's the one that gave his life away. And what did he accomplish? Because this whole fellowship offering, guess what it was? It was to celebrate peace between God and peace amongst each other. It almost sounds like communion, doesn't it? It's like we're going to celebrate peace between us and God and peace with each other because a blood sacrifice is made. Listen to this. Verse 15, Ephesians chapter 2. Talking about Jesus, by him setting aside in his flesh the law. He set that aside. The law was one thing and its commands because I was going to fulfill the law and its regulations. His purpose was to create in himself, Jesus, one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace. So he's bringing people together and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. No longer the wrath, no longer the division, no longer the wall between us and God. He came and preached peace to you who were far away and peace to those who were near. For through him, we both have access. Think about that doorway. Access to the Father by one Spirit. It's mind-blowing to me. Maybe I get a little more excited. Jesus on a cross, bleeding on the threshold for you and me, saying, I'm breaking down the door. I'm tearing the curtain from top to bottom. I'm making a way that you could be with me. That I would be, that our Heavenly Father would look at us and say, I'm your Heavenly Father and you're my kids. You know, I think about my own kids and, you know, their response to dad sometimes, and reasonably so. Again, why illustrations fall short, but where they've called me and said, I gotten myself in a little bit of trouble, whether it's car trouble or something they've done, and they've made a little bit of a mistake. And their assumption is, man, dad's gonna be mad because all the money and the stuff. Me and Dave know. You got lots of kids and vehicles and things happen. But I love that opportunity as a dad to go, no, all I'm going to say is it's fine and I'll take care of it. It's fine. I'll take care of it. I got this. Why would you think I would be mad? I love you. I chose you. I picked you. I'm your dad. I'm your father. Don't worry about this. We'll cover this. We got this covered. Don't worry. love it because sometimes the tears would stream down their face. They just couldn't believe it. We thought wrath. We thought anger. We get forgiveness, you know. Yeah. David's dancing because he didn't deserve it. He's like, I don't care about all these people. He's like, I can't believe we got the presence of God back in the tabernacle.